everyone, welcome back to Miss Adams Teaches Jekyll and Hyde. In this video we are looking at the final chapter of the novella, Henry Jekyll's full statement of the case, but we're looking at part 2. Okay, as this chapter is so long, I'm splitting it into 3 sections. If you haven't looked at part 1, press pause, go back to the playlists and find that before we begin. Let's get started. Some 2 months before the murder of Sir Danvers, I'd been out for one of my adventures, had returned at a late hour, and woke the next day in bed with somewhat odd sensations. It was in vain I looked about me. In vain I saw the decent furniture and tall proportions of my room in the square. In vain that I recognised the pattern of the bed curtains and the design of the mahogany frame. Something still kept insisting that I was not where I was, that I had not wakened where I seemed to be, but in the little room in Soho, where I was accustomed to sleep in the body of Edward Hyde. I smiled to myself, and in my psychological way, began lazily to inquire into the elements of this illusion, occasionally, even as I did so, dropping back into a comfortable morning doze. I was still so engaged when, in one of my more wakeful moments, my eye fell upon my hand. Now, the hand of Henry Jekyll, as you have often remarked, was professional in shape and size. It was large, firm, white and comely. But the hand which I now saw, clearly enough in the yellow light of a mid-London morning, lying half shut on the bedclothes, was lean, corded, knuckly, of a dusky pallor and thickly shaded with a swart growth of hair. It was the hand of Edward Hyde. I must have stared upon it for near half a minute, sunk as I was in the mere stupidity of wonder, before terror woke up in my breast as sudden and startling as the crash of cymbals. And bounding from my bed, I rushed to the mirror. At the sight that met my eyes, my blood was changed into something exquisitely thin and icy. Yes, I had gone to bed Henry Jekyll. I had awakened Edward Hyde. How was this to be explained? I asked myself, and then with another bound of terror, how was it to be remedied? It was well on in the morning, the servants were up, all my drugs were in the cabinet, a long journey down 2 pairs of stairs, through the back passage, across the open court and through the anatomical theatre, from where I was then standing, horror-struck. It might indeed be possible to cover my face, but of what use was that, when I was unable to conceal the alteration in my stature? And then, with an overpowering sweetness of relief, it came back upon my mind that the servants were already used to the coming and going of my second self. I had soon dressed, as well as I was able, in clothes of my own size, had soon passed through the house, where Bradshaw stared and drew back at seeing Mr. Hyde at such an hour and in such strange array, and 10 minutes later Dr. Jekyll had turned to his own shape and was sitting down, with a darkened brow, to make his feint of breakfasting. Okay, just to make sure you're happy with that, he transformed without trying. So he didn't take any potion, he just transformed. So obviously that's very worrying and dangerous, okay? Small indeed was my appetite. This inexplicable incident, this reversal of my previous experience, seemed like the Babylonian finger on the wall to be spelling out the letters of my judgment. And I began to reflect more seriously than ever before on the issues and possibilities of my double existence. That part of me, which I had the power of projecting, had lately been much exercised and nourished. It had seemed to me of late as though the body of Edward Hyde had grown in stature, as though, when I wore that form, I were conscious of a more generous tide of blood, and I began to spy a danger that, if this were much prolonged, the balance of my nature might be permanently overthrown, the power of voluntary change be forfeited, and the character of Edward Hyde become irrevocably mine. The power of the drug had not always been equally displayed. Once, very early in my career, it had totally failed me. Since then, I had been obliged on more than one occasion to double, and once, with infinite risk of death, to treble the amount. And these rare uncertainties had cast hitherto the sole shadow of my contentment. Now, however, and in the light of that morning's accident, I was led to remark that whereas in the beginning the difficulty had begun to throw off the body of Dr. Jekyll, it had of late gradually but decidedly transferred itself to the other side. All things therefore seemed to point to this. that I was slowly losing hold of my original self, of my original and better self, and becoming slowly incorporated with my second and worse. Super important things here. Edward Hyde is growing, as well as in physically, he's getting taller. It's getting harder to be Jekyll. So when he takes the potion, turning into Hyde is easy, turning into Jekyll is not. All of this fits in with his earlier hypothesis that because he hadn't used or exercised those dark parts of his personality, Edward Hyde was small and Jekyll was the main dominant part of the character. But the more he uses Edward Hyde, the more he explores being Edward Hyde, the stronger, more powerful, and therefore the taller he becomes. It's just like exercising a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it gets. Same thing with this dark side of Edward Hyde. Okay, let's keep going. Between these two, I now felt I had to choose. My two natures had memory in common, but all other faculties were most unequally shared between them. Jekyll, who was composite, now with the most sensitive apprehensions, now with a greedy gusto, projected and shared in the pleasures and adventures of Hyde. But Hyde was indifferent to Jekyll, all but remembered him as the mountain bandit remembers the cavern in which he conceals himself from pursuit. Jekyll had more than a father's interest, Hyde had more than a son's indifference. To cast in my lot with Jekyll was to die to those appetites which I had long secretly indulged and have late begun to pamper. To cast it in with Hyde was to die 1,000 interests and aspirations, and to become at a blow and forever despised and friendless. The bargain might appear unequal, but there was still another consideration in the scales. For while Jekyll would suffer smartingly in the fires of abstinence, Hyde would be not even conscious of all that he had lost. Strange as my circumstances were, the terms of this debate resolved in commonplace as man. Much the same inducements and alarms cast the die for any tempted and trembling sinner, and it fell out with me, as it falls with so vast a majority of my fellows, that I chose the better part, and was found wanting in the strength to keep it. Again, slightly complicated, but really important. It's basically saying, if he stays Jekyll, he'll still have Jekyll's desires, but won't be able to fulfill them. And he'll still have Jekyll's memories of being Hyde that he has now grown to enjoy. It says guns to pamper. He enjoys being Hyde and thinking about being Hyde. He's like, I'll always have those memories and will therefore always be reminded of what I can't have anymore. So he's saying that being Jekyll is actually going to be really quite painful. But if he's Hyde forever, okay, he'll be friendless and alone, but Hyde won't care. Hyde is id-based. He's completely formed from those deep base desires. He doesn't want those things. So he's like, actually, if I became Hyde, life would be easy, because Hyde doesn't give two hoots about Jekyll. He only sees him as a hiding place, something to kind of delve into, just to escape being found in awkward situations. But in the end, Jekyll has decided to be Jekyll. But the narrative hook here, the hint that keeps us going, well, hang on a minute, what happened next, is when he said that he was found wanting in the strength to keep to it, as in he wasn't able to. He was weak. Let's see what happens. Yes, I preferred the elderly and discontented doctor, surrounded by friends and cherishing honest hopes, and bade a resolute farewell to the liberty, the comparative youth, the light step, leaping pulses and secret pleasures that I had enjoyed in the disguise of Hyde. I made this choice perhaps with some unconscious reservation, for I neither gave up the house in Soho nor destroyed the clothes of Edward Hyde, which still lay ready in my cabinet. I'm so sorry for sneezing. Those of you who I teach will know that that is a regular occurrence. Sorry. Okay, so he's keeping hold of Hyde's clothes, so he blatantly doesn't want to be rid of him. For 2 months, however, I was true to my determination. For 2 months, I led a life of such severity as I'd never been attained to, and enjoyed the compensations of an approving conscience. But time began at last to obliterate the freshness of my alarm. The praises of conscience began to grow into a thing of course. I began to be tortured with throes and longings, as of Hyde struggling after freedom. And at last, in an hour of moral weakness, I once again compounded and swallowed the transforming draught. He did it by choice. Really important that you recognise on this occasion, this wasn't him turning into him by accident like he did before. He has chosen to turn into Mr. Hyde. I do not suppose that when a drunkard reasons with himself upon his vice, he is once out of 500 times affected by the dangers that he runs through his brutish physical insensibility. Neither had I, long as I had considered my position, made enough allowance for the complete moral insensibility and insensate readiness to evil which were the leading characters of Edward Hyde. Yet it was by these that I was punished. My devil had long been caged. He came out roaring. I was conscious, even when I took the draught, of a more unbridled, a more furious propensity to ill. It must have been this, I suppose, that stirred in my soul that tempest of impatience with which I listened to the civilities of my unhappy victim. He is, of course, talking about Carew. I declare at least before God no man morally sane could have been guilty of that crime upon so pitiful a provocation, and that I struck in no more reasonable spirit than that in which a sick child may break a plaything. But I had voluntarily stripped myself of all those balancing instincts by which even the worst of us continues to walk, with some degree of steadiness among temptations, and in my case to be tempted, however slightly, was to fall. Instantly the spirit of hell awoke in me and raged. With a transport of glee, I mauled the unresisting body, tasting delight from every blow, and it was not till weariness had begun to succeed that I was suddenly, in the top fit of my delirium, struck through the heart by a cold thrill of terror. So when he's beating Carew to death, the only thing that stopped him was he got a bit tired. Isn't that awful? And it's only on being a bit tired that you went, oh, hang on a minute. Oh, someone might see me. I better go. Oh, shocking. A mist dispersed. I saw my life to be forfeit and fled from the scene of these excesses, at once glorifying and trembling, my lust of evil gratified and stimulated, my love of life screwed to the topmost peg. I ran to the house in Soho and, to make assurance doubly sure, destroyed my papers. Thence I set out through the lamplit streets in same divided ecstasy of mind, gloating on my crime, light-headedly devising others in the future, and yet still hastening and still hearkening in my wake for the steps of the avenger. Hyde had a song upon his lips as he compounded the draught, and as he drank it, pledged the dead man. Literally, he does a toast to Carew as he drinks back his potion. The pangs of transformation had not done tearing him before Henry Jekyll, with streaming tears of gratitude and remorse, had fallen upon his knees and lifted his clasped hands to God. The veil of self-indulgence was rent from head to foot. I saw my life as a whole. I followed it up from the days of childhood, when I had walked with my father's hand, and through the self-denying toils of my professional life to arrive again and again, with the same sense of unreality, at the damned horrors of the evening. I could have screamed aloud. I sought with tears and prayers to smother down the crowd of hideous images and sounds with which my memory swarmed against me, and still, between the petitions, the ugly face of my iniquity stared into my soul. As the acuteness of this remorse began to die away, it was succeeded by a sense of joy. The problem of my conduct was solved. Hyde was thenceforth impossible. Whether I would or not, I was now confined to the better part of my existence, and oh, how I rejoiced to think of it! With what willing humility I embraced anew the restrictions of natural life. With what sincere renunciation I locked the door by which I had so often gone and come, and ground the key under my heel. Ha ha! Now we understand why he was trapped in that way, because it's at this moment that he's got rid of the key, you know, from the last night when he's like, oh, there's a key and it's broken. So he realizes now that there's absolutely nothing he can do. He can't start turning back into Hyde again because he'll get caught, because he's now like the most wanted man in London. So he's like, oh, thank goodness it's taken out of my hands. I have to stay Jekyll. There's nothing else I can do. The next day came the news that the murder had been overlooked, that the guilt of Hyde was patent to the world, and that the victim was a man high in public estimation. It was not only a crime, it had been a tragic folly. I think I was glad to know it. I think I was glad to have my better impulses thus buttressed and guarded by the terrors of the scaffold. Jekyll was now my city of refuge. Let but Hyde peep out an instant, and the hands of all men would be raised to take and slay him. I resolved in my future conduct to redeem the past, and I can say with honesty that my resolve was fruitful of some good. You know yourself how earnestly in the last months of last year I laboured to relieve suffering. You know that much was done for others, and that the days passed quietly, almost happily for myself. Nor can I truly say that I wearied of this beneficent and innocent life. I think instead that I daily enjoyed it more completely, but I was still cursed with my duality of purpose. And as the first edge of my penitence wore off, the lower side of me, so long indulged, so recently chained down, began to growl for license. Not that I dreamed of resuscitating Hyde. The bare idea of that would startle me to frenzy. No, it was in my own person that I was once more tempted to trifle with my conscience. And it was as an ordinary secret sinner that I at last fell before the assaults of temptation. Oh, what a place to end it. Sorry. But like I said, this chapter's very long, so we are going to pause here. So he's basically saying in that last little section, he's like, okay, it was good that it turned out everyone knew that it was Hyde. It meant that I had to stay as Jekyll. That was the right thing. And he reminds Utterson of that time they spent together when he was being really charitable. Utterson tells us about that, or we hear, about that in the remarkable incident of Dr. Lanyon. Sorry, there's a fly in here. That's most annoying. Sorry about that. That he, was doing loads of charitable work, getting more kind of religious in his philanthropy, and then suddenly you have that change. So he's just given us this little hint that it's not that he chose to become Hyde, it was something that he did as Dr. Jekyll that caused the problem. And there we shall pause, which means that you must tune into the next video to find out what happens next and how we reach the end of the story. Thank you so much for reading along with me. If you haven't subscribed, please click that button. You can see my face there on the screen so that you're always aware of what videos I am creating for the different parts of your English language and English literature studies. Thank you again. Happy reading, happy revising.